It was a Sunday, and a patient was deciding whether to shave today or tomorrow before going to work. He thought, oh, it's Sunday evening, I would really go for a run. But if you go for a run, after shaving, it's going to be so itchy. And I don't like that feeling. Then, what should I do? Maybe I should wait for tomorrow?
No.
Should I do it now? What did he do at the end? He finally chose to do it next morning earlier, even when he wanted to get up later.
Yeah, that's a typical, this is a typical of frontal lobe syndrome. We had patients exactly like that. They take forever to decide which soup to buy in the supermarket or when to come back to the hospital, tomorrow or the week after. And we explain, I mean, the reason why they do that, it's because the part of the brain that is damaged, it disables them from triggering that somatic marker, that bias your decision one way or the other. So that's the underlying deficit. Now, I think you asked me how you restore, how you rehabilitate somebody like that?
These two. Previously, this patient, my patient, had a brain injury in ventromedial, prefrontal lobes. And his executive functions are very good. But the making decision is very bad. It's narrow. It's impossible for him.
See, these people characteristically, they maintain a very normal and very high normal psychological profile. Their IQ is high, their memory scores are high, their attention scores are high. They have two kinds of problems. One of them, that you named, that they have an inability to decide, so they go back and forth to an extreme, because everybody sometimes wonder, should I do this or that. They do that to an extreme. The other problem is that if they have a choice that has some immediate benefit, but it can lead to negative consequences in the long term, they always tend to focus on the immediate benefit and they ignore the long-term consequences. That's why they lose their jobs and they go bankrupt and so on. In our work, we focused mostly on that problem, deciding according to the immediate term and ignoring the future. Not as much on the indecision, not being able to decide between this or that, but the underlying mechanism is the same. We've always argued that the problem is the lack of that somatic marker. That is, when you're deciding between two things, one of them triggers a stronger emotional signal, even though you're not necessarily aware of it, but it's a gut feeling that tells you I should do that.
Well, you see, look,
not every single type of decision requires a somatic marker. So there are a lot of decisions that can be done based on, rational reasoning or some matching or some prior knowledge. Somatic marker kicks in only when you're involving decisions that have some risk, some potential risk, or you don't know what the outcome are. In domains where the decisions can be figured out logically, a lot of these patients, they can decide on many things. It's just their weakness is that when they have to choose between two options and they have conflicts, those options have conflicts. There's something good and something bad about them. Other domains, they still have a lot of decision-making capacity. I mean, choosing between $100 and $50, that's a decision. They don't have a problem making that kind of a decision.
In your publications, you talk about addiction, and the the decision-making process, but also introducing willpower, in this case to resist drugs, I suppose. Could you tell more about this in a neurobiological way?
Well, yeah, I mean, willpower, in addiction you always hear about impulse control. And what is impulse control? Impulse control is all about a reward, and you want to resist that reward, so you control your impulse. But in many situations, you have something painful. It's like going for surgery. You endure the pain now in order to get the benefit later. So in other words, now you are controlling your tendency to avoid pain. You endure the pain in order to do it. So willpower, it's a more inclusive term. So the prefrontal cortex do both of these things. It's not only about inhibiting a reward tendency, it's also about enduring something painful as long as it's better in the long term. And at least in the human experience, that's both functions exist, and that's why I use the term willpower, because a lot of times it's actually overcoming a certain pain to get the benefit later. Inhibition, but of a different process. In impulse control, you're inhibiting a reward tendency, a reward drive. In willpower, I mean, it includes that, but in addition, it includes inhibiting an aversive tendency. So in other words, you want to avoid something, but you inhibit it in order to do it instead.
So how towards the decision-making process, or how to use, for instance, your task, the Iowa gambling test, in order to predict. How would you predict, for instance, the early stages of this is like Alzheimer's?
Alzheimer? Yeah. Well, we describe this actually in the manual. There is a fundamental difference between somebody who performs on the Iowa gambling task and they have an impaired decision making, so they make wrong choices, versus someone who's demented. They're not remembering anything. And the difference is that in demented patients or severe amnesic patients, their performance is random all the way through. So in other words, they don't show curves upwards or downwards. They're just picking 50-50 all the way through. As opposed to someone who has an impaired decision making, then you'll see a pattern. So they're either choosing the wrong DAC or they're choosing the good DAC. So they're making choices in a certain way. And we've done it actually, not only Alzheimer, actually patients who have bilateral hippocampal damage. So as long as you have a severe amnesia, the performance tends to be random. So, those 5 blocks that we show, you just see 0 all the way through.
I think about the frontal lobe dementia.
Frontal, yeah, this could come out like frontal lobe syndrome, because these patients are not amnesic at that point. Yes, and they have these same characteristics. Yes.
Perfect.
I mean, even we detect impaired decision making even in older people, some, not all of them, in some older people who look very, very good. And we always speculated that maybe these are the people who become victim to advertisement frauds. They go and they squander their money, yet everybody thinks they're normal, but maybe they're showing some early signs of impaired decision making, while everything else is still intact.
So after you developed the Iowa gambling test, actually, there have been more tasks. We know there have been tasks related, like gambling type tasks, but that are different from those that have been performed. So new ones. actual like new ones from the group, like new ones, not only the ones that all like task type of gambling type of tasks are performed, but new ones that are like have been useful to are new and novel in this way.
Well, I mean, I don't know how novel. There are tasks being continually produced in fMRI, from the economic literature, but in my experience, none of these are clinically valid. I mean, yeah, you do them in an fMRI, but they don't detect anything. They're not designed for that purpose. The only one that have been useful, like the origami test, is the Cambridge Gambler test, for example, the one by Robert Rogers and Trevor Robbins. The fundamental difference, though, this is why the AVA gambling test remains more sensitive to detecting decision-making impairments. The fundamental difference between the two tests is that the AVA gambling test has a component of what you call decision under ambiguity. That is, you have no idea what the probabilities of the outcome are. The Cambridge Gambler test, it's all an explicit, all the information is given in an explicit manner. There's another task called the balloon analog task, BART, balloon analog risk task, BART. But again, this test has been used a lot in addiction populations and the like, but it was never validated in neuropsychological populations, patients who have lesions. So these are the two useful tasks. Everything else that you see in fMRI, they're not clinically valid, and we even tried some of them, and they don't get you anything.
So how do you link the outcomes and the decision-making process? How is this task linked in the decision-making capabilities in daily life? People who have to, they face decision-making. Such as, for instance, if I score poorly in the Iowa gambling test, does that mean that my decision-making process, whether I take and make decisions in my real life, my daily life, that also shows on that, on my daily life decision-making process? Whatever I score, is that
we have to be careful here. We have to be careful between normal population and impaired populations. And this is the big mistake that a lot of people make. They took the AVA gambling test and they start running it on normal people and starting making interpretations, who makes a high score and a low score. In normal population, this tells you nothing, as far as I could say. It's like an IQ tells you nothing about how intelligent a person is. These tests were not designed to measure how intelligent you are, or how good of a decision maker you are. They are designed to detect impaired populations. So if you're dealing with pathological conditions and you detect an impairment, then it's a sign of, it's a confirmation of a clinical diagnosis. It's like any other test. You run tests to confirm a certain diagnosis. So it shouldn't be interpreted as in normal people as indicative, of a certain level of decision making.
With gambling tests, is it possible to predict who is not able to become an addict from those who probably won't be an addict?
Early on, we've been following this up in children, and this is exactly the theory we're working up, is that people who show signs of impairments early on, they're more likely to binge drinks and to smoke cigarettes and to use, drugs, in subsequent years. So basically, yes, it can be used actually as a marker, as a predictor, as a sign of a decline in frontal lobe function, and that could be a predictor of addiction. Now the question, we have to be careful. We don't know where the dividing line is, because people perform and it's sort of a normal distribution, but at a minimum, those at the very, very bottom of the curve, well, it's something to pay attention to, because we've run 2 or 3 studies right now in young adults, 14, 15 years of age, in Chinese school, and we follow them up 2, 3 years later, and yes, those with very, very bottom scores, even though they have very good scores at school and everything, are predictor of substance use in subsequent years.
Where in this decision-making process, were you most interested in? Which part of it? Where is your interest? Where can we place your interest?
Everything. I mean, my original goal always, I wanted to find a cure for addiction, and early on I started working with rats, and at that time everybody was working on the mesolimbic dopamine system. And then in the clinic, I used to go to the clinic and I would see patients, they're injecting heroin here in their jugular, and it could have killed them, because depending on the purity of the heroin, I was asking myself, why would anyone subject themselves to that kind of danger just to get the drug? And I begin to wonder or question the whole idea. There's a decision-making process, at least in humans, because not everybody who takes drugs ends up being like that. I mean, the rats do. You give them enough drugs and you can turn them addicted. The humans, there's always a small percentage who would do that. Most of everybody else, drink alcohol, they may try drugs, but they don't cross a certain barrier. So when I start looking around, well, who's examining those decision-making processes? Who's studying the role of the prefrontal cortex, for example, in addiction? There was none. That was in the early 80s. And this is what drove me to Iowa. This is how I ended up in Iowa. I said, well, let's do a little bit of that. It wasn't in addiction, it was just in purely frontal lobe syndrome, but it was a nice chunk of time where we shed a little bit more light on these mechanisms, and I keep going back, and I want to find the magic cure for addiction.
Yesterday I seen some ideas about the dopamine drugs in making decisions. What is your opinion about the methylphenidate prefaldine, in making decisions?
Well, I don't know. They could. See, those drugs, all drugs, work in an inverted U-shaped form. Too little of it, it's bad, but too much of it is bad as well. So you always have to reach an optimal level. So always in situations where you have potential pathology, restoring that chemical imbalance to the normal level can help the neural systems to rewire and to learn in the proper form, and it can be therapeutic, but it has to be examined, in a good way, because if you overdo it, then you are producing an addiction on its own. Any dopamine agonist ends up being like any other drug. So you have to get it to the right amount.
What's your opinion on the programs of cognitive rehabilitation with patient who has a problem making decisions.
Well, we heard about it last night, and I think Barbara was more honest than ever. See, the problem with cognitive rehabilitation in general is that, unlike exercising a muscle, for example, you know, with a muscle you get good with it and then you can kick a ball. You exercise the brain, you get very good, you get very high score on whatever test you're looking at, but it's very hard to see the translation into real life. I mean, this is what I used to sit, you know, in grand rounds, you know, those drug representatives who come and sell Alzheimer's drugs. They show you those graphs, which are impressive, you know, you see, my God, the improvement is just fantastic. But this is only on tests that you do in you know, in the lab. It's never been a noticeable improvement in their real life. So that's the problem. It's a more difficult topic to deal with. But I don't think I should say any more than what Barbara said. I mean, there are evidence for some improvement. It depends on how you look at it. But the most obvious one is that it's not as impressive as one would expect it to be. But definitely there are help provided with people who undergo rehabilitation, and I think this the issues that Barbara raised are even more important. You know, dealing with the emotional issues and the social connections. That's very, very helpful. So that's you know very, very useful, you know, from a rehabilitation perspective. Even though if you're not improving, you know, the brain mechanism itself a lot.